Welcome back to The Heat. We're discussing Africa and some of the major issues that were discussed over the weekend when leaders from all over the continent gathered at the African Union Summit. Welcome to our guests again. William, the ambassador raised a few points on African development, particularly things like unemployment, bringing the unemployment rate down, and also education. China's President Xi Jinping announced last year that there was going to be a $60 billion assistance program for help with development in Africa. How significant would that be towards Africa's development?
You know, I think as the ambassador said earlier on, it's going to be, Africa's own development will have to come from Africa in itself. I think, and that really, from the AU point of view, has to be a very key starting point of any development. Most of our development is not, unfortunately, going to come from outside. So yes, last year China pledged money to Africa, but I think we must understand the details of those kind of pledges. It's not that China is going to hand over the money to Africans. It is really to support Chinese companies to come, and operate in Africa or do business in Africa. Now, our problem is, from an African point of view, is that we don't identify, what do we want to develop, and then we bring our partners, to partner with us. So, and that is maybe, a new role for the AU must start re-looking at its role in development also. I mean, it would be, it would be good if the AU can start actually looking at what are the things that should be developed in Africa. How should we develop infrastructure, in order to get the African integration? How should we, what type of, companies should we want to bring to Africa? What kind of industrialization, and then partner with organizations. My fear is, if we look not only at, the past AU discussions, but also previous AU discussions, it's almost, there's a sense that we're waiting for outsiders, to bring the money and help us develop, and that we don't actually look at ourselves and to see what are the things, we've got raw materials, we've got commodities, how do we diversify, and then how do we bring in our partners like the Chinese to partner with us? So my fear really is that these really key strategies are not being discussed in the kind of detail and with the kind of political will at AU forums.
Dr. Kiamba, has Africa got the right mix here? Are they developing the right kinds of industries for a young continent? Are they putting money in the right place? Is the infrastructure plan, is it going to work?
I think I would agree with the last speaker. However, we do have everything that can make us become industrialized. For instance, we've got a vibrant, youthful population who are not only unemployed, but are also underemployed. And of course, we do acknowledge the fact that that big population does not have an input in the industrialization process. Having said that, we do have quite a number of countries that have come up with visions and, of course, missions and an outline that will guide them towards industrialization. However, when you look at the kind of resource mobilization, and also when you look at where it is being placed, I would imagine that it is being placed in the wrong sectors, first and foremost. Secondly, we do find really, at the end of the day, like the last speaker said, a lot of over-reliance on external regions to come and tell us what to do. Unfortunately, that has been there since independence. Would have wished for that to have ended in this decade or the last decade or since we attained independence. So I think what we need is maybe a set of strategic leaders for each of the countries, basically, to let us know how we can move on, because I would suppose that we do have everything that it takes. And one of the fundamental issues or one of the fundamental components is the youth. And like I've said, they are highly unemployed and also underemployed.
Ambassador, there are also things like so-called quality of life issues, challenges that Africa faces, things like nutrition, safe water, sanitation, energy. How have African countries done in that regard? Take a country like South Africa. There's been significant progress, hasn't there?
No, I think South Africa has had significant progress, and I think that at the AU summit, South Africa was recognized for massive achievements in meeting some of the goals of the Millennium Development goals that were stated. And I think that there was justified congratulations for a successful fight against Ebola. The problem is that donors often have a far better emergency plan for social quality of life interventions than they have the appetite for staying the course for the long-term preventative development that Africa requires. And the point that I think that William makes is that unless Africa is going to devise its own balance, and I think that for a while, driven by the NEPAD, the New Plan for Africa's Development, we had a template that we could invite the world to. And then we went into a lull, and so the world started telling us. So we were supply-driven rather than what was demand-driven. And maybe the point that Dr. Kiamba also makes is crucial, that we need champions and visionaries, but I would say not simply at the national level, we need it at the regional level. So we need regional economic integration so that we have regional plans for which roads will unlock the potential, which mode of transport will unlock the potential of an entire region. What orientation will the education take? Because we can educate everyone in languages and biblical studies and all of those kind of things, but if we've not defined a vision that we will be transforming gold and diamonds in Southern Africa into jewelry, and therefore we need this kind of artisanal education that will be going on, that we will make the square array telescope the driver of much of our technological thing, and therefore let us invest in the skills of astronomy and science and those kind of things, and then devise the syllabi that will feed that kind of thing. Unless we are able to really integrate at that kind of level and hold people to it and seed, each country seed a little bit of sovereignty for the overall regional good. Unless we do that, we are always going to be vetoed by the weakest amongst us, by the least visionary amongst us, and that's what I think we need to be able to change within the African context.
William, the ambassador mentioned Ebola earlier on. Ebola threatened the West African countries of Guinea, Liberia, Sierra Leone. Hundreds of thousands of victims died, actually. Is Africa now, when we look at that success story, is Africa now better prepared to deal with a crisis like that?
You know, it's at least if we can learn the lessons, from Ebola, and and that really is the challenge. Often it appears, from a continental level, we are not, we're repeating the same mistakes over and over. But I wonder, I mean, just to take, from the ambassador, whether we may have to start looking at a different African Union, maybe because of the, the kind of crisis that we have now, the kind of challenges in Africa, whether the current format of the AU, whether it is still appropriate. I mean, is it, for example, should we perhaps look at the AU that would have, a couple of, let's say, committed countries with a political will maybe driving, a one track, and then we have, a second track of maybe, let's just say, African countries that are not so committed, to integration or to common development and so on, and maybe, another group that's very, very far off. I'm starting to think whether we should not challenge the way the African Union is operating. Is it appropriate? Is it appropriate model where everyone has the same vote, and at the end of the day, we've got, countries or political leaders that doesn't have the political will to do anything, actually make the decisions, for the continent not to move forward. And maybe for me, that really is the immediate challenge now. How do we refashion the African Union to make it more relevant for the challenges of our time?
I think William is making the exact point that the AU was making this weekend about the structure and the functioning of the United Nations. Because the United Nations was based on an international model after World War II that excludes Africa, that excludes large parts of Asia, that excludes South America in its Security Council and its major decision-making bodies. But it hasn't shifted for the new millennium to a global governance model in which the smallest can't hold back the overall development, or the powerful don't monopolize all power. And so maybe I think the point is that the African Union needs to also become a model of the reform it wants to see in the United Nations.
And that was a point brought up by the outgoing chairperson, Dr. Robert Mugabe, the president of Zimbabwe, who said it's time for Africa to be recognized and possibly be recognized as one of the permanent members of the UN Security Council. That time has come.
I think that time has come a long time ago, but again, looking at the contradictions, will Africa have the means to send its most competent and capable countries to it, or will it be a lowest common denominator discussion that we will have amongst ourselves and disable us from taking up the opportunities of global governance?
Dr. Kiamba, what do you think? Is it time for the African Union to take a strong, hard look at itself to figure out, are we doing our jobs here? How can we be more effective? How can we solve the pretty formidable problems that this continent faces?
Yes, I agree with you. I think it's time for the AU to look at itself much more closely, to look at what we've done wrong, to look at the opportunities that are provided for us to enhance peace and security in the region. And I think one of the things that is quite crucial for Africa and the African Union is to begin developing ways and knowledge that will enhance our peace and security. To a large extent, we've relied overly on the United Nations. Even though we do get our mandate from the United Nations Security Council, when it comes to matters of intervention in other states, I would suppose that I think the African Union has the tools available. Indeed, we have, one can say, a lot that we can learn from. We can begin developing, for instance, mediators in Africa. We do not need mediators from outside the region because we already know our problems, really. So I do suppose that, yes, we need to look at ourselves quite closely, look at traditional methods and alternative methods of dispute resolution, as well as conflict management, rather than always taking back the issues to the United Nations, even though, of course, we do get the mandate from there. So I do suppose that we have a lot of looking inwards that we need to do, and of course a lot of studies that we need to do when it comes to the management of conflict, the resolution of disputes that we see between quite a number of states, and of course you know, the political will when it comes to the management of those particular conflicts.
Dr. Anita Kiamba, William Gumede in Johannesburg, Ambassador Ebrahim Rasool with me here in the studio in Washington. Thank you all for